Hey everybody, welcome back to Investing with Wesley, and in today's episode I want to explain to you why I truly believe the next downturn we'll see in the stock market won't just be a correction or a recession. I truthfully feel like we are on the brink of an extremely large depression era event. And this is due to the things I talked about in my last two episodes. One, the SOFR rate, and why the SOFR rate being connected to the US Treasury's repo rate is such a terrible thing when it comes to having that as our benchmark rate. In my last episode, I talked to you guys about how the SOFR rate is basically replacing LIBOR, and all the things that LIBOR was connected to, the SOFR rate will now be connected to it. So although it does affect variable rate mortgages, loans, and that kind of thing, the scariest part of SOFR taking over LIBOR is that SOFR will now be connected to things like derivatives. And I explained to you that the US repo rate randomly skyrockets upwards of 5% overnight. And if rates that skyrocket that high randomly overnight are connected to things like derivatives, the entire derivative market could implode. But I also made a huge statement saying that the Federal Reserve may have inadvertently caused us to go into the next Great Depression. And that's exactly what I want to explain to you today. If you remember from my last episode, I talked about the golden tickets of collateral being the Treasury bonds. And that when commercial banks need money, they give up Treasury bonds to the Federal Reserve in exchange for bank reserves. As well as quantitative easing done by the Federal Reserve also removes Treasury bonds from the system. And with those two things systematically removing Treasury bonds from the market, the United States Treasury's repo market that is all based upon T-bills as collateral will eventually start rising due to less and less available collateral. So because the Federal Reserve's main job is to keep interest rates and inflation in check, it would have to find a way to control the SOFR rate from skyrocketing. And you see this in most recent graphs, and the Federal Reserve openly stating they're going to commit to trillions of dollars directly into the repo market to lower that rate as much as possible. Now, I know when we were talking about the LIBOR rate, I said that a lot of people were complaining at the fact that it is so manipulated. Well, you could also argue that the Federal Reserve pledging to inject trillions of dollars directly into the repo market is manipulation of itself. But for now, we'll just move past that because the Federal Reserve has been injecting trillions of dollars into the entire market itself. For now, let's go back to the SOFR rate skyrocketing due to less and less available collateral in the form of those Treasury bonds. When the SOFR rate starts skyrocketing, the Federal Reserve's job is to get that rate into control and make it go back down. Now, at that point, the only way that we could get it under control is for the US government, not the Federal Reserve. Remember, those are two different entities. The only way we can get the SOFR rate back under control is to inject more Treasury bonds into the repo market. And the only way we can inject more Treasury bonds into that market is for the US government to create more Treasury bonds, which also means spending more money. Now, when the US government spends more monies and creates more bonds, naturally, the interest rates of everything else start to rise. Now, we definitely don't want interest rates to rise because then we experience things like inflation. As well as if inflation and interest rate rises too much, then things like personal, corporate, and government debt will start to catch up to us because interest rates go up, meaning the interest we pay on those debts goes up, and it becomes that much more expensive to borrow money. This is why the Federal Reserve loves low interest rates, because we are so overburdened in debt that we need as low of interest rates as possible so that we can actually carry these debts with us until the GDP rises enough to pay for those debts. But here's the issue. SOFR goes up because of a lack of golden ticket collateral. So the US government has to create more collateral to throw it into the system, but doing so raises every other rate out there. So how can we do this without raising other rates and having all this debt catch up to us? Well, there's only two ways to do this. Print more money or raise more taxes. And the thing is, you can't really raise taxes. Sure, there's an argument for the ultra rich to pay even more taxes, but the thing is, they know all the tax loopholes and can afford really good lawyers and tax attorneys to make sure they pay as little as possible. As well as those on the complete opposite side of the spectrum don't make enough money to pay taxes. So if we were to put into effect a tax plan that would effectively raise money for the US government, it would come out of the middle class's pocket. And you have to remember, it is the middle class itself that is completely overburdened in debt. So yes, the US government could potentially raise taxes to cover all the funding they need to inject more Treasury bonds into the market. But raising taxes effectively just on the middle class is going to be nowhere near enough money. The only other option the US government has to raise money is quantitative easing, where the Federal Reserve prints more money and directs that money somewhere. The last quantitative easing we saw, the Federal Reserve printed a bunch of money and injected it straight into corporate bonds. With the next quantitative easing that I'm talking about, we could see the Federal Reserve printing trillions of dollars and then basically handing it over to the federal government so that they could spend it on Treasury bonds. So what does all this exactly mean? Well, SOFR rate goes up. So the government has to raise money somehow to inject Treasury bonds into the market. Doing so raises every other rate out there, but does lower the SOFR rate temporarily. Because the US government can't necessarily raise taxes that much more, they're forced to use quantitative easing. And as we explained earlier, quantitative easing also removes Treasury bills from the market. The best example I can give you of this process is like a teeter-totter, where on one end you have quantitative easing and the other hand you have the SOFR rate being connected to the Treasury bond repo market. As one goes up, the other goes down, and it just keeps going back and forth. But you have to remember, you can't pay debts with fake money for very long. This would be like the US government using trillions of dollars in credit to pay for its other debts. And then when those debts clear up, they use that excess credit to pay for the new debts. And you're just basically doing a balance transfer back and forth. Meanwhile, nothing is really getting paid, and the debts on each side, every time they cross that teeter-totter, just go up astronomically in the trillions of dollars. And you also have to remember that these are just the debts. We still have government spending that needs to be done on all of our government's projects. So when you factor all those things in and the constant switching back and forth of where the debts are allocated, you can see that eventually it's all going to erupt. Now, I'm an investment advisor and by no means an economist, but from my opinion and based on my knowledge of how the economic machine works, there's only 3 ways to fix this. One of them we can completely rule out, and that is the form of socialism, where no one makes a dime and every dollar earned from people working goes to the government. That is a short-term solution, and I hardly think that the US is ever going to go socialist. That leaves 2 other solutions. First solution is inflation. And I mean massive inflation. This is the kind of inflation where the US government just prints as much money as humanly possible. So although the value of the dollar will be completely worthless, there'll be so many dollars printed that they'll be able to pay off all government debts. And if they go this route, I really hope they're generous enough to pay off everybody's student loan debts and even mortgage debts, because at this point the US dollar would be completely worthless due to inflation. Now, the other option out there is deflation, and this is where government spending, personal spending, and business spending completely stops. This is basically the payback scenario. I think we'll both agree that when anybody, whether they're a government, business, or person, takes on debt, you are guaranteeing at some point in the future you have to pay back that debt. Now, hopefully that debt is used to accrue more assets, and you use the money that those assets are giving you to pay that debt off in the future. But for most people, this isn't the case. For most people, they'll go to Best Buy or Walmart or Costco and put a $1,500 TV on a credit card and spend a couple months paying it off. But you're guaranteeing for those next couple of months, you are lowering your spending somewhere else so that you could pay back the debt you took. And this is exactly what the deflationary period does. Everybody cuts back their spending. That way there's more supply than demand. We saw this in the beginning period of the 2020 coronavirus market crash, where everybody was staying inside and there was so much gas, oil, and reserve things that we experienced a little bit of deflation, and that's what kept our inflation of quantitative easing in check. No one was really spending money because they didn't know in what direction the market was going to go. And that caused a deflationary period in the US dollar, meaning the US dollar actually got a little bit more valuable because not as much goods were being sold. It all goes back to supply and demand, where if there's a lot of supply and no demand, the price of said object goes down. But if there's a lot of demand and short supply, obviously the price goes up. If even the government itself cut back spending and focused their excess liquidity on lowering their debt, creating a little bit of a safety hedge, this would be a deflationary event and the value of the US dollar would actually go up. But this would also throw us into a depression-like event. Because no person is spending money on goods, those businesses producing those goods aren't getting any money. And if those businesses aren't getting money, then they can't afford to pay their employees, a salary. Thus, more layoffs happen, and it's just like we saw in 2020. And at this point, the government can respond really in two ways. One, they can respond like this. Sorry guys, you're completely out of luck. My bad, but we're doing us. We got to focus on us right now and take care of our debt. Which I think we both agree that would probably never happen. The second option is just like they did in 2020, they provide more stimulus checks. Well, where do you think they're going to get that money? Because it's not going to be in taxes. It will be in quantitative easing. So you see, it all goes back to this. The U.S. economy is based and operated off of debt. And if we all even agree to do a deflationary period so the government can focus on its debts, we as individuals are going to pay the price, as well as the entire stock market is going to come crashing down. Now, let's talk about the inflationary option, because in my belief, that's probably the one that the U.S. government will actually go towards. And that's because they get most of their money from businesses, not individuals. So they have a vested interest to make sure big businesses succeed because that is their main source of revenue. That's why in the dot-com bubble, the GFC of 2008, and this pandemic shutdown, you saw the government bail out big businesses before handing out money to the small businesses and individuals. So assuming that the US government sticks to its current philosophy, we'll see the level of inflation skyrocket, and the effective US dollar will be pretty much worthless. And once the US government debt is completely paid off or deleveraged or restructured, however you want to phrase it, once the US debt is under control, then the US government can introduce a brand new currency. Whether it's just a new dollar that looks different or is calculated differently, or it's something on the crypto realm like the US dollar coin, only time will tell what the government will introduce. But because of quantitative easing and the debt shuffle teeter-totter that the government and Federal Reserve keep doing, the second interest rates inevitably skyrocket or someone loses a little bit control over that teeter-totter, we're going to see a depression-era event. Because we are so overburdened in debt, and not just government debt, but also business and personal debt. So what can you do to prepare yourself for a giant inflationary depression? Well, I explained it a little bit in my last episode, and that is things like commodities that have inherent value and are a storehold of wealth. But I should also note that in depression era events like we last experienced in the 20s, commodities like gold, oil, and that sort of thing also took a dip, but they weren't hit as hard as paper investing like the US stock market. Now, honestly, my initial idea for my own investing and finances was to store some of our excess cash reserves in a different currency, something like the euro or the British pound. But my fear is that if the US does have a depression era event, because we have been the reserve currency of the world for so long, I'm fearful that other currencies and other economies are going to come crashing down with us. So even if I put my excess cash in something like the euro to avoid the inflationary effect it would have on the US dollar, I could still come out in the negative if the European Union's economy does crumble with the US's. But once again, I just want to reiterate that I'm an investment advisor and not an economist. And although I understand that all the signs are there, there is no way to predict how soon this is going to happen. It could be tomorrow, or it could be 25 years down the road. One thing's for certain that you could do right now, though. That is to set yourself up with a budget and get rid of all bad debt that you have. Once all bad debt is paid off, then you do things like save in cash and invest into the stock market, as well as some commodities. If you're unsure what kind of ratio you should put your money towards, like how much money you should put into cash versus stock market versus commodities, then feel free to call me or find some other investment advisor out there that can educate you on exactly where to put you. But once your debt is paid off, focus on investing, because the truth is, long term, even if you just invested in the S&P 500 index consistently month to month until you retire, even though you'll experience several dips along the way, you'll still come out ahead long term based on averages and statistics. With that being said, guys, I really hope you got value from this video, and if you did, please remember to like and subscribe, because it really helps the YouTube algorithm get this channel out there so that I could help educate and warn more people on the foreseeable future. Until our next episode, have a good one.